All right, so diving in depth today. We're going way beyond the surface level. We're going into the principles of Jeet Kune Do.
Jeet Kune Do.
Based on the book Jeet Kune Do, The Principles of a Complete Fighter by Ron Balicki with Dr. Stephen Gold. And I think, our listeners are here because they want that shortcut to knowledge.
Yeah.
They want to get the real understanding of a topic, like without having to, spend years and years
Right.
reading every book and going through all the different training methods. Although, arguably you should do all that. But we want to extract the good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. This is kind of your cheat sheet to getting to the core of JKD.
Yeah.
Looking at the philosophy behind it, how they approach training,
Yeah.
and the unique perspectives that this book brings to the art as well.
Yeah, and the authors here are they're pretty well equipped to break this down. We've got Ron Balicki, who was a longtime student of Dan Inosanto, and also has a lot of experience in different martial arts, even in law enforcement.
Yeah.
And then, in addition to that, we have Dr. Stephen Gold, who's a philosopher and also a student of martial arts. So they're coming at it from a lot of different angles, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
But, it's also worth noting that Dan Inosanto himself wrote the foreword to this book, and he really emphasizes in there the importance of Jun Fan Gung Fu as the foundation for JKD.
Yes.
So, that's going to come up. But our mission today is not to, get another style,
Right.
or a set of techniques.
Yeah.
It's to extract the concepts.
Absolutely.
What are the concepts of JKD? Because, as we'll see, this is about adaptability.
Yes.
And being fluid and not about having a fixed style.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's jump into it with this first idea of, JKD as having no style. And this, Bruce Lee really broke away from traditional styles because he felt that they became too restrictive.
Yeah.
They could lead to what he called ossification.
Yeah.
And that by becoming too locked into a system, you could become rigid and dogmatic.
Yeah.
He even famously said, in classical styles, system becomes more important than the man.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of this. So the system itself starts to outweigh the needs and the abilities of the individual.
Yeah. And what's interesting here is that, instead of creating another defined entity, JKD is really the way of no way.
Yeah.
And the style of no style, which really gets to that core of being, completely adaptable.
Right.
The book states that Jeet Kune Do favors formlessness so that it can assume all forms.
Uh-huh.
And it goes on to say, be like water, my friend. It takes the shape of whatever it's in.
Yeah. And that's a really good point, because a lot of people, I think, when they're trying to achieve that adaptability, they think, well, I'll learn this martial art and that martial art and that martial art, and then I'll have all these tools, I'll be adaptable.
Yeah.
But it's really the mindset
Right.
to discard what's not working.
Yeah.
So it's not so much about like, I've got all these tools. It's more about the ability to be like, well, that's not working. I'm going to discard that
Yeah, absolutely.
and move on to something else.
Yeah. And you see that a lot of, I think, martial arts kind of fall into that trap.
Yeah.
Of we have the best, or our style is the most complete, which kind of goes against this whole, core principle.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because, the book, it does bring up this idea of, if JKD is supposed to be this fluid, adaptable, personal journey,
Yeah.
then why do some JKD people kind of claim to have the true JKD?
Yeah.
Like it's another style that they're guarding.
Yeah. Yeah. And the authors, they connect this to the idea that, knowledge is power.
Yeah.
And in the martial arts world, claiming to have like the definitive understanding of JKD can be a way to kind of like gain influence and attract students, right?
Right.
So it's a way to like, I guess, establish authority in a marketplace.
Yeah. I think you're right. And I think that's a really insightful point about the dynamics.
Yeah.
Of how martial arts are taught and operate, I guess, in the marketplace. The book makes it clear, though, that their aim here is not to provide a step-by-step manual.
Right.
Or to claim that they've discovered the correct JKD techniques.
Mm-hmm.
They even refer to Linda Lee Cadwell's introduction in the Tao of Jeet Kune Do to kind of reinforce this idea that it's really about the principles, it's about the concepts, and allowing individuals that freedom to kind of interpret and apply it in their own way. And this ties into this whole idea of Bruce Lee's dynamic view of the world.
Yeah.
You know, he rejected these static, unchanging ideas,
Right.
you know, in favor of this constant movement and adaptation.
Yeah.
What they refer to as following what is.
Yeah.
In the book, and there's a quote here. They say, "Having totality means being capable of following what is."
Yes.
So if you're fixed on one particular way of doing things, you're going to miss the ever-changing reality.
Right. You're not going to be able to adapt to the fluid situation in front of you.
Right. So it's not that JKD like throws out forms or classical training completely.
Yeah.
The book, it makes it clear that these can be valuable tools,
Yes.
but only if they contribute to the ultimate aim,
Right.
which is efficiency.
Right.
Or, as they put it in the book, anything that scores.
Yeah. Which I think is a very, very simple way of putting it, right? It's
Yeah.
like, if it works,
Right.
then it works, you know?
Yeah.
Don't get too bogged down in whether it looks pretty
Right.
or if it's from this style or that style.
Right.
If it works, it works.
Right. And I think and they include a really important caution here.
Yeah.
That I want to read. They say, "Do not deny the classical approach simply as a reaction, for you will have created another pattern and tracked yourself there."
Right. Yeah. So you're swinging from one dogma to another, basically.
Right. So just blindly rejecting traditional methods could be just as limiting.
Yes.
You know, you've got to approach it with discernment
Yeah.
and identify what truly serves you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So this leads to this discussion of how JKD is taught, the pedagogy.
Yeah.
And the book kind of points out that there's this tension
Yes.
between the live, the fluid, the ever-changing nature of fighting
Yeah.
versus the way that we have to like statically break down movements and concepts
Right.
to teach them.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So they use some really good examples here.
Yeah.
You know, you could think about a knife flow drill
Yeah.
where you might learn 7 distinct stages.
Right.
And in reality, that flow is continuous.
Yes.
There are no breaks.
Absolutely.
You know, it's all happening at once. Or they also mention Wing Chun hand techniques like Buji, Zhong Sao, Tan Sao.
Yeah.
Those are taught as separate things with structures.
Right.
But in reality, they often just blend together
Yeah.
in a real encounter.
Seamlessly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought that was really interesting that they pointed that out. And what's also fascinating here is the responsibility of the instructor.
Yeah.
So they're pointing out in the book that, you know, for the purposes of learning, like the theory, the structure,
Yeah.
the instructor has to, you know, temporarily make the art non-living.
Right.
So they're creating these static points to explain how something works. But then, you know, the student or the really critical understanding is that when you're in that dynamic situation, you have to transcend that static learning
Right.
and allow your responses to be fluid and intuitive.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, you know, learning the blueprint, but not mistaking the blueprint for the actual building.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So you need to understand how things work structurally.
Yeah.
But then when it comes time to actually apply it, you're not going to be, you know, mentally checking off a list of techniques
Right.
in the middle of a chaotic exchange.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's something that you see in a lot of like beginner martial arts classes, especially.
Yeah.
They get very like focused on doing the form exactly right, you know,
Right.
every single hand position.
Yeah.
And they lose like the practical application of it.
Right.
And that's where a really good instructor comes in, is being able to like blend those two things together.
Right. To teach the fundamentals, but also be like, look, this isn't the be all and end all.
Right. Exactly.
You know, this is how we get you there.
Yeah.
Okay, so JKD is often characterized by its eclecticism.
Yeah.
It draws from a wide range of martial arts.
Right.
You know, it's often talked about as being, you know, everything and nothing,
Yeah.
embracing all styles and none.
Right.
But there's this critique that's often leveled against eclecticism that, you know, jack of all trades, master of none.
Right.
So how does the book address this potential drawback?
Well, I think first off, they point out that that's not really the case for a lot of JKD players.
Right.
You know, like Ron Balicki himself. They point out that he's reached high levels in a lot of traditional arts.
Right.
So it's not just about like superficial exposure.
Right.
It's about really in-depth exploration and then integration.
Right. Right. And I guess the thing that really helps you decide what to take from all these different things is simplicity.
Right. Absolutely.
You know, Bruce Lee famously said, simplicity is the shortest distance between 2 points.
Yeah.
So the book presents that as the essential test. Like, what do you incorporate?
Yeah.
What do you discard? What's simple?
If it scores, it's probably simple.
Right.
And if it doesn't score, it's probably too complicated.
Right. And it almost connects to, I think, to the philosophical principle of Occam's razor.
Yeah.
You know, the simplest explanation.
Right.
So JKD, efficiency, is really defined as anything that scores.
Yeah.
You know, so they're very practical about it.
Yeah, which is good. It's refreshing, you know, compared to some of the more like esoteric martial arts out there.
Right. Okay, so this ongoing process of exploration and self-evaluation, it demands a particular mindset. You know, the book talks about the secure fighter.
Yeah.
So what does that mean in the context of JKD?
The secure fighter is someone who is able to actively seek out areas of ignorance.
Right.
So it's not about like always trying to win or to be right.
Right.
It's about being, you know, honest with yourself.
Yeah.
About what you don't know.
Right.
And then actively seeking out those challenges.
Right. And being willing to fail.
Yes, being willing to fail.
Yeah.
Right. Because that's where the learning happens.
Yeah. I like that they say that you know, the real JKD player looks for failure,
right?
Because that's where the growth happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And this also means, you know, being able to let go of the comforting truths,
right,
of established styles,
right,
and being able to face the uncertainty,
right,
like not knowing.
Yeah. There's a Bruce Lee quote here. It says, "To express yourself in freedom, you must die to everything of yesterday. From the old, you derive security. From the new, you gain the flow." So it's this idea of having to let go.
Right.
Of the old ways of doing things.
Yeah, letting go of that dogma, letting go of, you know, what you've always been told.
Yeah.
And being able to adapt to new information.
Right. And it goes even further than that.
Yeah.
It's not just about letting go of styles, but you also have to be prepared to let go of what JKD itself should be.
Yeah.
There's this quote here. "To understand Jeet Kune Do, one ought to throw away all ideals, patterns, styles. In fact, we should throw away even the concepts of what is or isn't ideal in Jeet Kune Do."
Right.
So, you know, if you get fixed on a specific idea of correct JKD, you inadvertently create a new style.
Right, which then becomes limiting again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're always trying to stay ahead of that rigidity and maintain that fluidity.
Yeah, you're always evolving. You're always learning.
Right.
Yeah.
And this kind of leads into a really interesting discussion on the business of martial arts.
Right.
So the book kind of critiques this idea of the marketing strategy of claiming to have the one and only, the best, the complete martial art.
Yeah.
They use this analogy here of someone mistaking like yellow leaves for gold coins.
Yeah.
So, you know, the idea here is that like less experienced people, they can be really easily misled.
Yeah, they're looking for that shortcut.
Right.
That easy answer.
Right.
And they're willing to pay for it sometimes, quite literally.
Right. And it makes you think about how expertise is presented in a lot of fields, right? It's not just martial arts.
Yeah, absolutely.
They also talk about some specific trends that have emerged in the martial arts world, like the emphasis on grappling in the 90s with that argument that all fights go to the ground.
Yeah.
You know, and the book counters that by saying, well, okay, even if that's true, you're missing out on this whole other thing.
Right.
If you're just focusing on the ground.
Yeah, you're neglecting all these other crucial elements of fighting.
Right.
You know,
stand-up weapons and also this idea that you can't deal with multiple attackers, which the book rejects that as well.
Yeah, they point out that that's a fallacy that's often perpetuated by people who have like very specific systems that only focus on the ground or whatever it may be.
Right. It's a convenient excuse.
Yeah.
And ultimately, they say here that the truly secure individual in JKD understands that there is no like hidden perfect style.
Right.
There's this quote here. Bruce Lee says, "Fear comes from uncertainty. When we are absolutely certain whether of our worth or worthlessness, we are almost impervious to fear."
Yeah.
So, it's about embracing that uncertainty.
Yeah.
Right.
Not trying to find that certainty, but rather to be comfortable with not knowing.
Absolutely.
And that to me is a big part of the real deep understanding of JKD.
Yeah.
But it's more than just combat skills.
Right.
The book talks about ethics.
Yes.
And this idea of personal development.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that Bruce Lee, he was very much influenced by Eastern philosophy.
Yeah.
And so for him, there wasn't like a strict separation between moral character
right.
and self-defense.
Right.
Ethics and martial arts training and personal growth. It was all intertwined.
Yeah, yeah. And at the base of all this is self-knowledge.
Yeah.
The book quotes Bruce Lee saying, self-knowledge is the basis of Jeet Kune Do because it is effective, not only for the individual's martial art, but also for his life as a human being.
Right. So it's about being able to look at yourself, understand your weaknesses, and work to improve them.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that's so important for any martial artist, but also just for anyone in general, right? Being able to be honest with yourself about your strengths and your weaknesses. Right. And then work to improve.
Right. Yeah. This idea of confronting yourself is really powerful.
Absolutely.
Okay. So let's shift focus a little bit to the practical aspects of training.
Go ahead.
The book talks about how it's a challenge for instructors to create environments that really reflect the realities of a confrontation.
Yeah.
So what are some of the specific types of equipment they talk about in the book that are good for JKD?
So first off, you can't talk about JKD without talking about focus mitts.
Right.
The book actually credits Dan Inosanto with introducing focus mitts to Bruce Lee. In the early 60s.
Wow.
And they quickly became like a defining tool of JKD training.
Yeah.
They allow for dynamic and realistic training at all ranges.
Yeah.
Long range striking to medium range encounters, close quarters trapping, even like simulated ground fighting scenarios.
Right, right. So you can do so much.
Yeah.
With those mitts.
Yeah.
And you can really hit with power.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And the instructor can really put realistic pressure on you.
Right.
So it's not just about like hitting the pads.
Right.
It's about like feeling that resistance.
Right.
And having to work against it.
Yeah. I think too, one of the unsung benefits of mitt training is that it helps develop power in your training partner who's holding the mitts.
Absolutely.
Because they have to learn how to absorb that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a two-way street.
Right. So what else besides mitts?
Well, they also talk about Thai pads, which, weren't originally used by Bruce Lee himself.
Right.
But serve a similar function.
Yeah.
In terms of, developing power. Yeah. And providing like a really good anaerobic workout.
Yeah. I think people too often underestimate the cardio aspect of pad work, whether it's focus mitts or Thai pads.
Absolutely.
Because you're constantly moving, you're under pressure.
Yeah, you're getting that adrenaline dump.
Right.
And you're working hard.
Right. And you're also you're practicing unloading.
Right.
That's a good term.
Yeah.
Okay. So what about we have to talk about the wooden dummy.
Right. The mukjang.
The mukjang.
Yeah.
And Bruce Lee brought that from his Wing Chun background.
Yeah.
And it's a staple really of JKD.
Yeah, it's great for developing sensitivity, refining your technique, building conditioning, and it really reinforces good form. Right. And that forward pressure as well.
Yeah. Right. And I think that's one of the things, if people are watching a JKD practitioner or someone who's really, really skilled in it, that forward pressure is one of the things that really stands out.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's something that Bruce Lee really emphasized.
Yeah.
Always being on the offensive.
Right.
Always moving forward.
Right, right. Okay, so Any other types of equipment that they mention in the book that are useful?
Yeah, they talk about target training, whether that's pads or paper or even people.
Right.
And Bruce Lee was actually really innovative in his approach to target training.
Yeah.
He would use, paper in particular, they point out was really good for developing that explosiveness.
Right, right.
And that ability to visualize a target and just unleash.
Yeah. No hesitation.
Yeah, no hesitation. Yeah. And then, of course, punching bags. The heavy bag, speed bag, double end bag. Yeah. All of these are really important for developing different attributes.
Right, right. Timing, coordination.
Yeah, timing, coordination, rhythm, power generation, overall conditioning, stamina, that ability to just flow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting how they point out that, while Dan Inosanto introduced a lot of these tools to Bruce Lee, it was really Bruce Lee's creative application of them.
Yeah.
That really kind of brought out the best.
Yeah, he was very much an innovator.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was always looking for new ways to train and to improve.
Right. Right. And they do include in the book, too, some examples of specific Jim Gung Fu focused mitt drills.
Yes.
For practicing different entries against like crosses and kicks.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they do get into some of the specifics, which is cool.
Absolutely.
Okay. So let's talk about weapons. The book, it kind of starts this section with a very fundamental acknowledgement that someone who's skilled in the use of a weapon has a huge advantage over an unarmed person.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of people, especially in the martial arts world, kind of shy away from.
Yeah.
They don't want to they don't want to think about that.
Right.
But it's the reality.
Right.
And so it's important to acknowledge that and then to train accordingly.
Right, right. And JKD, it encourages practitioners to be open-minded about different weapon systems.
Absolutely.
So it's not about like JKD has its own knife fighting.
Right.
It's about taking the principles and applying them to any weapon system.
Right.
Yeah.
The book specifically focuses on the stick and the knife as being among the most common and practically relevant weapons you might encounter.
Right. And for the stick, they talk about its value in terms of training attributes like speed, coordination, timing, and they really draw on the Filipino martial arts for that.
Right. Yeah. Filipino martial arts have, centuries of experience with stick fighting.
Right.
And so it's a really, really rich source of knowledge.
Right. And they explain, the Sanawali drill as an example of how to develop ambidexterity and the state of like no mind where your reactions become automatic and fluid.
Yeah. You're not thinking about it.
Right.
You're just doing it.
Right. Right. And they also really emphasize the practical applications of stick training expert.